Welcome, everyone, to the Retire with Style podcast. I'm Alex Murguia.
And I'm Wade Pfau, and we're excited to welcome everyone to this new podcast to talk about retirement planning. I think it's important to let everyone just get a little bit of sense about who we are. And ever since that Amazon review of my book, Retirement Planning Guidebook, Alex has been known as my sidekick. So I think to only be fair, we should let him start first with an introduction. So Alex, can you give us a little bit about your background and why it is you're involved in a podcast on retirement?
Sure. Although, Wade, they do say a man's reach should always exceed his grasp. So just being recognized as your sidekick, I guess I'm already there from that standpoint. But now I'm Alex Murguia, and a little bit about my story. I'll start with graduate school. Went to GW with psychology under the doctorate program in psychology, clinical psychology. And there was a strong research practitioner model, and I erred on the side of more of a researcher as opposed to a therapist. And my introduction to money happened when I effectively received a fellowship from the National Institutes of Health to conduct an investigation towards healthcare beliefs and utilization and trying to quantify those beliefs and how it affected how somebody, specifically Latino groups, utilize healthcare. Within that vein, with the fellowship, I was awarded, a grant money. And as any of you that are in graduate school know, whenever money and graduate school don't go hand in hand. And so I thought, my goodness, I'm rich. Look at this, and the idea was, now what do I do with this? How do I invest it? And a little bit about my background before then. I'm first generation Cuban American, so my parents coming from Cuba, went to Miami, and really investments is not a thing, for the most part. It's a strong working class culture. So the idea is you invest in your human capital, which we'll talk about at some point, and really you become a lawyer, you become a doctor, and if you weren't one of those two, you're going to have a conversation with your parents, perhaps an engineer even. But the reality is that investments wasn't something front and center. And so I took this research practitioner model and armed with a scientific method, if you will, it was, okay, how do we invest? How do I manage this money accordingly? And that just opened up a significant research interest for me with regards to investments. And by the time I was graduating, I obviously needed to finish that course of work. If not, my mom would have driven up from Miami and personally made sure that I finished what I needed to finish. As soon as I completed the doctorate, I realized, okay, I am going to, I want to go into this field as opposed to something that has to do with healthcare utilization, et cetera. The psych-driven track, if you will. My research interest effectively shifted towards the investment world. And I wanted to go to New York, make it big, that kind of story. But I didn't have anything on my CV that had the word finance in it. And frankly, my wife's uncle, Dean Umamoto, who's a mentor of mine and really has influenced me professionally, in ways that I can't quantify, effectively said, hey, Alex, why don't you jump on in here? He had it's called McLean Financial Planning at the time. Now it's McLean Asset Management. And it was a burgeoning insurance planning firm with, it had some toehold in investments, but it wasn't, building it out as much. And he let me in there, and my world just opened up. From the viewpoint of, oh wow, there's this thing called financial planning I had no idea of. You can actually contextualize the investments in a manner that provides success, et cetera, et cetera. And I just fell in love with that, and I haven't looked back since. We've grown McLean Asset Management to a full service wealth management firm, and in that path, I realized I had this entrepreneurial bug, because at the end of the day, I view the world as a series of experiments. Obviously, if I remained in an academic track, it would be about publishing. But in an entrepreneurial sort of world, there's many ways that significance testing can manifest itself. Largely, did it work or didn't it? Was there a market for it, etc. And that's where I came into contact with Wade. Wade and I, with Bob French, who you'll hear from regularly in this show, Wade and I, we started a financial planning company for advisors, and that's how we met about 10 years ago, right, Wade? Something like that?
Yeah, I think we're really right at the 10th anniversary of meeting.
Yeah. And many folks don't realize this about Wade. I mean, he's this erudite person, but he's one of the nicest folks that you'll ever meet. Most very approachable, etc. And we just hit it off, and we realized, why don't we do things together? And in addition to the financial planning software, we also have Retirement Researcher, which is this educational site really geared towards consumer. And we started this project that, really was the genesis of why we're launching this podcast, which is this idea behind a retirement income style awareness, which was a research project that Wade and I did that, took its own form, and now it's burgeoning into an actual application. But that's the story of myself and why I'm here with Wade. It really is something that just started from a personal curiosity, with regards to finance, that has just continued along a professional trajectory. I think I'm one of the few folks that I really don't view that I've worked a day in my life. I've always, and I've been very fortunate, I've always sort of positioned myself where my research interests and my professional interests have aligned accordingly. And it's made all the difference, and here I am with Wade. Wade, fire away.
Yeah, and so Alex is a psychological researcher, and I'm coming at it more from the economic side. I knew by the end of high school I wanted to be an economist. I majored in that in college, went to a graduate program in economics, and then realized that graduate economics is very different from undergraduate economics. It becomes applied mathematics, and I was always looking to do something that's more applied or practical. I did find a way to do that, writing a dissertation about Social Security reform that, in a way, though I didn't know it at the time, really would be the foundation of the career I had, which was looking at in the early 2000s, there was a proposal, if you recall, to create personal accounts, or to carve personal accounts out of a portion of Social Security, so that rather than your payroll tax going into the trust fund, a portion of it would move into personal, kind of like 401k plans or IRAs. You would invest on your own for a portion of your Social Security taxes. And that really, again, I didn't realize it at the time, but that's what I've ever been talking about since then, in terms of, do you take a risk-pooled insurance-based approach to covering your retirement spending need, or do you take a individualized investment-based, rely on market upside to fund your retirement spending needs? And there's always been a lot of debate about that. Now, I did get sidetracked from focusing on that for a while. My job out of graduate school was to be a professor at a public policy institute in Tokyo, Japan, working with government officials from around the world. I focused on pension funds and worked with students from Thailand, from Vietnam, from Pakistan, from Cambodia, and other places, and just learning more about how national pension systems worked. Now, at some point, I did want to return to the United States, and I didn't have a clear trajectory about how to do that. There's not a lot of demand for someone who knows all about the inner workings of the National Pension Fund of Thailand in the United States. So I thought about how to be more marketable. Came across the CFA program, which is an investment-based program for investment professionals, studied that curriculum, came across this idea, the 4% rule used in retirement planning there, didn't know a lot about it, realized it was based on U.S. historical data, though, and I had access to data from 20 different countries. And so my first study that moved more from the world of economics to financial planning was looking at, did the 4% rule work in other countries around the world, and finding that it didn't necessarily work as well as just the U.S. historical data would suggest. I sent that article to the Journal of Financial Planning, which at the time was one of the leading practitioner research journals in the financial planning or retirement planning space. And it was an amazing situation. Usually academics, when they publish articles, they sit on university bookshelves. No one ever reads them. And that was not the situation. The other thing for academics is it can take 2 or 3 years for your articles to get published.
Right. I thought your vanity plate on your car was going to be revise, resubmit.
Revise and resubmit, yes. So with the Journal of Financial Planning, I submitted, I think it was early September 2010. I did have to revise, but the article was published December 1st, 2010. And not only that, but people were actually reading it and discussing it, and I was getting reader feedback about it. And that really then led to me to realize and understand that actually this whole financial planning, retirement planning area, it was new in academics. The first PhD program in financial planning didn't even exist until I think the year 2000 is when Texas Tech started their program. So when I started grad school, there was no such thing as like a financial planning PhD. But this is really an applied area, practical area of economics that I could really put my efforts into.
What would you say was the biggest decision you made in Japan? It's a loaded question, man. It's a loaded question.
Well, I suppose I went there as a single person straight out of grad school. When I moved back to the United States, I brought 3 more people with me. So that was probably the biggest decision.
There you go. No, I just wanted to... In case your wife is listening to the first episode, I want to make sure you get that in there.
Right. But so coming back to the United States, I at the American College of Financial Services, and that's a big part of what I do. That in addition to other hats that I wear, the director of our Retirement Income Certified Professional Program at the American College, which it's for financial advisors to really, it's a curriculum about retirement income. And that being at the ground floor of all that, it's retirement income is distinct from financial planning. And that's a big part of what this podcast will be about. The traditional wealth management approaches people have pre-retirement, you have to modify that post-retirement. And that's what I realized, I didn't realize with the dissertation, but when I started looking at how people talk about retirement planning, just seeing how you could ask a basic question and get a completely different answer based on who you're talking to. Something like, is the 4% rule safe for retirement income? You'll hear some people say, absolutely. It always worked historically. It's always going to, there's no guarantee it'll work in the future, but at least from that mindset, there's a 99.9% chance it'll work in the future. Ask other people that same question and they'll say, no, that it's fundamentally a flawed concept. There's no such thing as a safe spending rate from a volatile investment portfolio. And the 4% rule calls for that. So
hey,
you got to...
Hey, we're going to have lots of time to talk about... We're going to have many episodes to get into the nitty gritty. I say this, I think, so I apologize if I'm taking this off course a little bit, but on the behalf of the listeners that hear you quite often, this is why they come, no doubt. But I think in the back of their heads, they're always wondering, who is the real Wade Pfau, kind of thing. And if you wouldn't mind, let me bring this up, and maybe you want to share. But what are a few things you think no one really knows about you that you enjoy quite a bit, or that you
probably the one that
or whatever,
maybe you were. So Alex lives 15 miles from Mount Vernon. So one time when I visited him, he learned about this firsthand. One of my hobbies is to visit the grave sites of all the presidents. And another related hobby is to visit all the Olympic host cities. And in recent years, I haven't been able, there's still a few I'm missing, but it's been a slower process. It was really something I could focus on more in my 20s. But someday hope to check off all the marks on that list. And yeah, just traveling and seeing.
And in case we have any shorthand radio enthusiasts in the audience.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, amateur radio. I've gotten my ham radio license. I've got my shortwave radio, although these days the internet seemed to completely wipe out. There's very little left in terms of shortwave listening, at least based on sending signals to the U.S. I think it still may be a bigger deal in other parts of the world.
So wait, you must have been in the radio and electronics club in high school?
Absolutely. I was thinking more in the STEM science world until about 11th or 12th grade, and that's when I switched from science to social studies.
Really?
So, yeah,
I wanted to play for the U.S. in the World Cup. Those were my aspirations when I was in high school. That's pretty good. They also say, and just a little bit about Wade without, tell me about Wade without telling me about Wade kind of vibe. They say you're the average of your 5 closest friends, right? Well, let's put a little wrinkle to that and say you're the average of your 5 favorite TV shows, if you will. And I think this is another thing folks don't really recognize. I mean, every time he speaks, he's talking about something serious with regards to retirement planning, and it could be dry, but Wade has a heck of a sense of humor. And so I'll load it up a little bit like that. But Wade, what are some of your top favorite shows that you like?
Yeah,
Unfiltered,
interesting
unfiltered,
question.
man,
So
unfiltered.
we can divide those between shows that I can watch with my kids and then shows that may not be appropriate for children. So,
Let's go PG-13.
the Good Place is probably my favorite show of all time. Adventure Time was a great cartoon to watch with kids. And then Alex, you and I I think you introduced me to Rick and Morty. I thought that was a great show. Community, that was a wonderful show. Veep was another show I watched somewhat more recently and really enjoyed.
Is that why you started cursing lately? And that we've needed to mute you on some of your presentations?
Yeah, I've got to always turn down the volume when Alex is talking offline here. If there's any kids near my office, now that I work at home.
Yeah. No, that's it. I just think, it's kind of cool. And yeah, Wade and I have the similar sort of taste in the Americana entertainment, if you will. But there it is. That's a little bit about us, and we'll pepper this throughout these podcasts. But I just think it's kind of cool to just get a sense for how we are and where our worldview is and how we interpret things, because I think that's important when we present our ideas and the like. Now, a question that you could ask is, why does the world need another podcast? If you will, and why retire with style? And incidentally, Wade and I had to for 5-10 minutes decide, hey, is it retire with style or retire in style? How's it going to be? And we ended up going with retire with style after Wade checked the grammar and the whole theme.
Yeah.
Wade, do you want to maybe give the whole essence of why retire with style and why now?
Yeah. So we had to Google that, and so in style was more about like what's fashionable, but with style gives you more a sense of you're doing something with grace and dignity and the way you want. And it links to, and I started going down that direction about how you can have all these arguments about how to build a retirement strategy, that there are different retirement income styles. And so that's kind of the play on retire with style. What's your retirement income style? You can hear a lot in the consumer media about, should I just use investments? Should I use an annuity? Should I build some sort of bucketing strategy? And at the end of the day, we think these are all potentially viable strategies. I've done a lot of research in the area of just risk pooling versus the risk premium is the way I call it. But any of these approaches can work, and it really then depends on what resonates with the individual. And so Alex and I have been working on this idea of the retirement income style awareness, and really would like to have a podcast around that, so that we view that as step one of retirement planning, is to understand your style. And from there, then you go on and you can build out all the other pieces to having a comprehensive retirement plan.
Yeah.
And throughout the course of the podcast, we want to address all these different issues. I think that's really the heart and soul of things, right, Alex?
No, I agree, Wade. I think, and you get this. Wade does some sort of webinar or he's speaking at a conference, and it happens all the time where he's presenting an approach, not necessarily his preferred or his whatever. He's just presenting an approach, and somebody on the other side of the spectrum, has issues with it because they think there's one approach to rule them all. And I think that's a mistake. Wade and I feel there's many credible ways to solve your retirement income puzzle. To think that strategy A is better than strategy B because it optimizes for whatever, how many points you're going to have when you die relative to the other one. I don't know. I think that's an incomplete view of the world, if you will. And there's many, not that that's wrong or right, but there's a multidimensional view of things from different folks, and it needs to be taken into consideration in terms of what strategy fits. I don't really feel, and Wade and I talk about this all the time, we don't feel that, now, once you establish that there's many credible strategies and you kind of identify them, the reality is that picking a strategy that fits your style, that fits your preferences for how you want to source retirement income, will lead to better results. And what I mean by better results, more likely for you to implement and maintain your plan, right? I mean, Wade, there's always going to be inflection points with regards to what should I do in retirement. Should I do this? Should I do that? Et cetera, et cetera. And if you decide to on-ramp into a plan simply because one person recommended it based on how that person's worldview optimizes, their own sort of idea of what a successful retirement is, then you need to be lucky and make sure that that also subscribes to your philosophy. Because it doesn't, that's where you begin to wonder. You look at your statements, and let's say something is not quite right, and you say to yourself, why am I doing this again? Why did I do this? Those kind of things. And this is different than the market goes up and maintaining volatility. It has nothing to do with that. It has more to do with, these are the characteristics of how you're sourcing retirement income, and do they fit you? And I think that's important. I mean, it's there's always going to be inflection points, and picking a plan that matches your preferences is the starting point, is that recipe for that success. Wade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's step one, and that's really kind of highlighted to me. So as long as I've known Alex, these 10 years, I've been writing a book on retirement planning and got sidetracked along the way.
Are you saying I was your inspiration? Are you saying I was your inspiration?
Yeah, spun off. You were my inspiration. But it spun off 3 books. So it's the book I've always been trying to write was actually the 4th book I published, the Retirement Planning Guidebook. But it's a lot of things came together in doing that, because that was really my effort to create a full picture around retirement planning. And it became clear in doing that. Step 1, chapter 1 of the book is understand your retirement income style, because you can't really go any further than that until you know it. And I even say in the book, then there's a chapter about investments. There's a chapter about annuities. You might want to not necessarily read both of them, or at least put more emphasis on one or the other, but you don't know which chapter is right for you till you know what your retirement income style is. And so you gotta understand that first, and then all the other decisions can start to make sense.
And Wade, just here's a question. In your view, do folks realize when they're listening to professionals that professional is, and this could be a professional, a pundit in the Wall Street Journal, somebody on CNBC, whatever, do you feel that individuals, when they're listening to these folks, recognize that, okay, this is one of many strategies, as opposed to, okay, what this person is saying sounds credible, this is what I have to do. Okay, the advisor whose door I walked in through showed me these charts that make absolute sense, this is what I have to do. Or do you feel there's ever a knowledge a priori where a person walks into an advisor's office, or is changing tone and starts listening to someone? Do you think they're trying to reconcile, does my preference sort of match what this person's saying, and if so, let's explore this further?
I think a lot of times people miss out on being introduced to this idea that there are multiple viable strategies. They'll hear the approach of one person, and just because they may lack the expertise or defer to the authority there, that must be the right way to do things. And so there are a lot of financial service professionals, and also a lot of, not just from like professionals, but media, online discussion boards that present one particular style as being the superior approach that everyone should use, and all of their styles are inferior and wrong. And you miss that nuance that, no, that's not necessarily the case. And I see this a lot, even on the online discussion forums. It's very popular, but there's definitely a tilt in online discussion boards towards a particular style that emphasizes the stock market and investments and market growth. And you can see the voices trying to meekly speak up. No, I'm income protection. That's a viable strategy too. But the dominant voice is shooting that down and really trying to say, no, you don't need risk pooling. You don't need insurance. It's just all investments. But on the opposite end of that too, you have people that say, you shouldn't ever rely on the stock market. Everything should be based on some sort of secured, protected income. And that's also not going to resonate with everyone. And that's where increasingly financial services is pointing towards a direction of one particular professional can offer multiple approaches, multiple strategies, and be able to serve the client or the customer where they are with getting the strategy that's right for them. But that's a slow process. Most frequently, it's going to be that professional has one style in mind that they'd like to apply to everyone. And you better hope that by random chance, you're speaking to the person who naturally matches what's going to be best for you.
Or what could happen is you're in that meeting and you can't quite put your finger on it. And even though the rationale, the advisor's making sense, it's not like they're speaking gibberish or anything like that. they're making sense, but it's just not hitting you the right way. You listen to that meeting and you do a lot of yeah, but that kind of thing. It could be simply put that regardless, the logic makes sense. It's just not aligned with your worldview. And I like to use this example. And Wade, you chime in if I'm off. I'm going to just go off on this, but I like to use the example of, okay, when you're deciding to retire, the decision is now, all right, I need to transition my portfolio to accommodate now retirement income. And so you're making the decision now, how do I draw from this investment capital to effectively give me a paycheck in retirement? How do I create a paycheck in retirement? All right? There's many ways to do that. And that decision, there's many ways to do that, and there's many ways to do that work. All right? That decision, though, is no different than when let's say you've gone through school, and you've gone through undergrad or whatnot, and now you've built up your human capital. You've built up your human capital to be able to earn a living now, right? And there, what you're asking yourself is, well, what are my preferences? What do I like to do in terms of earning a living? It's not like there's a high school guidance counselor, and that high school guidance counselor tells every person graduating from high school, or guides them, if you will, or college or whatnot, says, you know what, you should become some sort of government employee, mid-level government employee. Why? Because that's going to provide you a stream of income that you're going to have a relatively nice standard of living, or you can accommodate yourself to that standard of living. You're going to have job security, the sort of volatility, think of it like that, and you're going to have a pension when you retire, right? You could make the case that if you optimize the similar way that we optimize portfolios, et cetera, that's a very healthy, quote-unquote, Sharpe ratio, return relative to the volatility, et cetera, et cetera. There's that, right? But you would never think of that. That sounds unconscionable. Like, who would do that, right? And so it's not that different. It's somewhat analogous here, where when you're deciding how you want to choose to mine that human capital, you choose professions that are relative to what your interests are. Hey, look, I like meeting with people, interacting with people. I like the game of sales, if you will. So my job, I like being this front of the house entrepreneurial salesperson. I want to be an actor. I want to be you're going to have your high school teachers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It runs the gamut. But no one really says, hey, being a doctor is not better than being an engineer, is better than being no one says that. Because ultimately it's what's your passion, pursue that, et cetera, et cetera. And I really don't think it's that different. Yes, in the fringes, the analogy breaks down. But the reality is that you're making this decision professionally to mine your human capital. When you retire, it's the same dynamic. You're making a decision for how you want to mine the investment capital that you've accumulated, and that runs the spectrum. And to say this is better than that, I don't believe that's the case. I mean, the right strategy is the one that fits your style. And that's ultimately what we want to get at here. And then once we've helped you choose that style, or identify that style, then there's options for it. Similar to choosing a car, since we're on this analogy, right? There's many ways to get from point A to point B. If you want speed, take a Porsche. If you want safety, Volvo. If you want convenience, minivan. Incidentally, Wade has a minivan. Just pointing that out now. So do I. It's the best purchase I think I've made, with cars in my entire life. But if you want to emphasize personal values, get an electric car, a hybrid, whatnot. It's that kind of sense. And so it's hard to. It's the same thing when you're choosing a retirement income strategy. There's many levers you can pull to execute on one of those, and those levers depend on your style. As a starting point, obviously you need to run the numbers, see if it works, but to us, we think that's important and that's overlooked. And if you can align this properly, we strongly feel it will help from just from an execution and maintenance standpoint. Wade, I know I went off there on a little soapbox, but thoughts?
I think it's important. It's a good analogy that, yes, there's more than one way you can get things done. And so find the way that's right for you. And that's what really makes this podcast distinct from a lot of other retirement-based podcasts, because we're not just going to push one particular strategy. We're going to try to be agnostic and help you find the strategy that's right for you.
The other piece, and I think you can talk about this a little bit, when you identify your style, and you hinted at it, but I think it merits unpacking. I thought I would never use that phrase in this podcast since it's become the phrase you make fun of, right? Unpacking, I like to say simplify the overwhelm. If you identify with your style, you don't have to start from top down. You can start from a bottom up approach, which make things a lot more feasible to apply. And, what I'm getting at is, Wade has 4 books, right? The internet is full of stuff on retirement income planning. The problem is now everything is hidden in plain sight. And so if you know your style, if you have a preference and you've identified with a certain style, you can begin the analysis there. And then, view it as concentric circles. Then if you can't make it work, then you go out a little bit. You can't make that work, you go out a little bit. But eventually, you'll target in on the solution that works for you. It really defeats this analysis by paralysis. We have a lot of folks that are subscribed to retirementresearcher.com. That's our website where we provide a lot of education. And one of the questions that we get frequently is, hey, Wade, hey, Bob. No one addresses me. Hey, Wade, hey, Bob. I've read everything here. Things are good. How do I start? How do I transition? If you find yourself asking yourself those questions, that impetus to move forward, it's probably because you're just overwhelmed. You're reading everything, and now it's the moment of truth. Rubber meets the road, and you just can't get that going. And I think knowing your style really makes things simple for you. Not in a dumbed down way, but in a way that lets you focus on where to begin without having to boil the ocean. I mean, the last analogy that I always like is, when you want to read a book, right, and you go to the library, I don't know if anyone goes there anymore, but if you go to the library, it's not like you start at the books that start with A, and just go all the way to Z until you found the book you like. No, you go to what kind of book, fiction, nonfiction, etc., and you begin to whittle it down. And so by identifying your style, it makes that filtering process a lot more bespoke to how you want to source retirement income. Again, another soapbox of mine that I'll get better at.
You nailed it, Alex.
Wait.
You nailed it.
Wade's a man of few words. No, but that's the theme of this podcast, and we're excited to be bringing this to you folks. We really are. Wade and I we've been toying with this idea for the last 2 years. Part of it is just inertia on our part, and the other part is, okay, if we start, we really gotta make sure we commit to this. And we're at the point that we're absolutely ready and excited to get going and bring these thoughts to you. So thank you very much on my end. Thank you for listening. Wade?
Yeah, thanks everyone. And if you're a listener from the future who's binging through the episodes, let's get you going with the real content that's going to start coming up in episode number 2.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.